So, hello everybody, and welcome to the Women Talking Money podcast. I'm Gretchen from Magenta Financial Planning and She Finance, and today I'm delighted to welcome Adrienne Donneky to the show. She's a family lawyer with over 25 years experience supporting clients through relationship breakdowns, particularly when finances are involved. Her work covers everything from arrangements for children to the often complex financial issues that arise on separation and divorce. She's known for her down-to-earth, no-nonsense approach and regularly advises on complex and high net worth cases, including those involving business assets, pension trusts, and agricultural interests. She also specialises in relationship planning, such as prenuptial and cohabitation arrangements and agreements. So, Adrienne, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Gretchen.
So do you want to just tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your career journey so far and what you're up to?
Yes, so I have been, as you say, a family lawyer for a very long time, my entire working life, in fact. I'm originally from the southeast in Kent, southeast of England, and I went to state school, and I had it drummed into me by my parents from day one that if I was going to get on in life and be able to afford a home and all the other things that you need as an adult, and if I was going to have a family and support them, then I needed to work hard. And luckily, I seem to have the personality to be conscientious and take all that on board. So I managed to get my GCSEs, got my A-levels, and I went to law school, albeit I sort of just about got enough grades to get onto a law degree. And I went to study in Swansea in South Wales. And so I got my law degree and everyone else was applying for law school. So I thought, well, I better do the same. So I applied for law school, got my LPC, legal practice course, and then managed somehow to get into a law firm, a small high street firm in Kent. And I trained doing sort of mainly property and family law, qualified, and I don't know, 25 years later, I'm still a family lawyer, which was sort of the last seat in my training. So yes, I sort of assist people when their relationships go wrong. I've sort of got a bias in advising in relation to finances, but I manage a team of lawyers. So there's 5 of us in the team, and we cover pretty much all aspects of family law. So divorce, finances, children. Also advising non-married couples in relation to disputes that arise. That's normally in relation to property. And I also draft prenuptial agreements to try and protect wealth when if a relationship were to go wrong, if a marriage were to go wrong. And I also draft cohabitation agreements, which the average man in the street has never heard of, but that's to try and avoid a dispute if a cohabiting non-married relationship broke down. So that's what I do, really. Don't ask me to draft your will or anything else like that. But so those family law areas is what I cover in my work.
Excellent. Well, I'm looking forward to covering quite a few things that you've talked about, and hopefully we can bring some really good stuff to this podcast so that we can talk a little bit about how we can protect ourselves and really think about how things go when you don't want to think about things going wrong, but if they go wrong in your relationship. So I think, we definitely need to try and cover that up as much as possible today. I know it's going to be really important to the listeners. Can you, to start off with, because I always start with this question, sort of talk a little bit about you to start off with in your sort of earliest memory of money and reflecting on that, how you think it might have shaped your views and decisions that you maybe now make?
Well, as I say, I wasn't from a wealthy family. I was from your sort of standard working class family and a very traditional sort of family at that time in the sort of 70s, a dad that worked and a mum that was a stay-at-home mum raising my sister and I. And as I said before, I sort of had it drummed into me that there wasn't going to be anything handed to me. I was going to have to work hard, get some exam results, get good exam results and find a decent job. So that's really my first memory. I mean, one of the early ones, probably not that appropriate, but my mum saying to me in the supermarket, "This is where you're going to be if you don't get your grades." So that's the way I took it on board. But I've been fortunate that I had supportive parents, and I got those results, and I passed exams, and I just kept battling to get a decent job and develop a career. So I'm fortunate that I'm someone that's never had to worry too greatly about money because I've always been employed. But I know that isn't the same for a lot of people, especially in the current climate with, a lot of people that are not, even if they are in a decent job, they're not earning enough to cover their basic needs. So I've been fortunate in that regard, that I've always worked and earned a reasonable amount to cover the costs that cover the things that I need to cover.
So it feels like the messaging was work ethic, but also almost like a professional career was going to be the thing that could better the situation rather than being, as your mum said, at the supermarket.
Well, I think she wanted more for me than she perhaps had herself. My
Yeah.
mum was extremely bright, but she didn't have the opportunity to have a career. In her generation, it was far more difficult for people to go to university and get degrees and become professional, especially if you were female. So I think part of that was her wanting that for me and my sister. I can't say as a child I knew I definitely wanted to be a lawyer. I'm not sure. That wasn't something I think I consciously picked until sort of almost at the end of university, because it was sort of,
Mm.
well, this is the path I've gone down now. I'm not sure what else to do. Fortunately, it's panned out, but maybe if I had my time over again, I'd do something completely different. But
I always find that quite a difficult reflection, because the reality is, if you really love what you're doing, which it sounds like you do and you're passionate
yeah,
about, then actually now you know it, maybe you would pick it again anyway. But at 18, you don't know that these professions in as much exactness anyway exist, do you? And you don't understand what that could lead to.
I didn't really have. I think the careers advice people were given then perhaps as good as it is now. But yeah, I didn't really know. I didn't really understand what my options were. So anyway, this is where I am. But
Yeah.
I do the best part of about my job, and it sounds really cheesy, but is helping people come from a really, really difficult place to seeing them come out the other end when they have, sorted, everything's been sorted out, and they're in perhaps a new home, their own home, and, separate from their ex-spouse, and they've got a fair share of, the assets, etc., and they can move on with their life. And that's the best part of my job, most certainly.
Absolutely. It's not cheesy. I think it's, life changing to see someone now at the other end of that is and start to feel confident in themselves is amazing. It relates quite nicely to sort of my next question, which is around money worries. Everyone has money worries. We might, no matter how much money you've got, I think people still do have money worries. But I'm quite interested to understand, maybe given your role and professional job that you're doing, what things you think you see coming up when you're having discussions with people around starting to think, maybe they're starting to think about separating or going on the first steps of it, but are worried about their money and money confidence.
I mean, so often I see scenarios where one person has controlled the finances, or maybe not controlled as such, but the arrangement has been that one person has been the person that looks after the finances and makes sure the bills are paid every month, and the other person's in the dark. That seems to be relatively common, I would say. I see lots of scenarios where people, through perhaps no fault of themselves, but they've survived on a lot of credit. And when even if they're quite big earners, it's amazing to see how much credit card debt a lot of people have.
Wow, right, yeah.
They've perhaps either, as I say, incurred that because they had no alternative, or they didn't really mind living on credit, and they like to be, someone with a nice car and, whatever else. There does seem to have been that culture for quite a long time. But yes, certainly scenarios where often people can't see a way out of their situation because they cannot see how they could possibly afford for one home to become two, and or perhaps they're the lower earner of the two, and the other person, they can see how they're going to be able to get a big enough mortgage with their share of the pot, but they can't possibly see how they're going to manage to. And another classic one is they come to see me and they say, well, my husband's, or it may be wife, but for example, husband has done a spreadsheet. He's told me what we've got. He's told me what I can have. And he's told me that we shouldn't be spending money on noise because that's just going to deplete the pot. So I just want to keep it simple. I just want to do what he's said. And I say to them, we need to have some disclosure, and then I can advise you properly. No, I don't want to spend money on disclosure. I just want it over with. And I can fully appreciate that sort of sentiment. But of course, that settlement will affect them for the rest of their days. So, you know,
The reality is, you are absolutely trusting someone to give you that information. That information may not be correct.
Exactly.
I see people, the reality is an awful lot of people don't understand what those assets are, especially if they're pensions, and what their values are.
Well, that's another big one. People focusing on, often it's the female. I just want the house. I don't care about his pension. And of course, often you have scenarios where the pension is worth way in excess of what the equity in the house is. But there's the majority of people, or many people, don't understand the true value of pension funds. They don't really understand them. They're complex assets. And all they can think about is, well, I just need to keep the house and then I'll be fine. And if they're in their 40s and 50s, they really are potentially making a poor decision. But it's for someone like me to make sure we've got all the information and then work out how we can divide the capital and the pension, plus take into account the income, to make sure there's a fair settlement, to try and ensure that needs are met on both sides. Yeah.
Yeah. And when you sort of spend time talking with people through this, do you think there's anything that comes up that you can share that might be great kind of top tips or a top tip for someone who is in that position? Like you mentioned one of those things earlier, which was like, didn't even imagine that we can split these households into two. What can they start to think about if
Well,
they, or what do
yeah.
they need to know?
Yeah. Well, I would say, one, at least have one meeting with a solicitor, a specialist family lawyer, because it's amazing how much information you could receive in that one meeting to understand the process. That solicitor would hopefully also explain the different ways they can sort things out. And that isn't just through solicitors. Mediation is a form in which a trained mediator can help the two parties try and reach an agreement. And that's often more cost effective than, back and forth through solicitors. And you can have perhaps a lawyer advise you in the background at a couple of meetings, but mediation, there's something called arbitration, which is basically avoiding an expensive court process and going straight to someone making a decision, to try and save costs. But so certainly have a meeting with a lawyer, because they can give you a lot of information. Even if you think, well, how I'm going to fund it thereafter, just at least have one meeting. Because if someone's railroading you, a good lawyer should be able to see in that one meeting whether you're being railroaded, manipulated, whether you're really about to make the worst decision of your life. You would hope that lawyer would at least be able to steer you away from that. Give her your options about the alternative ways to resolve a dispute, and perhaps make sure that you understand to ask questions about things like pensions. Make sure you get the value of things, including pensions, and don't just focus on the house. And one other thing I should say is, a lot of people say, I just want to get divorced. We've sorted out who's having what. And they get divorced, but they don't have it put in a final financial order. If you don't have what you've agreed put into a final financial order, you haven't ended future claims. So you sell the house, you have your bit. If other person falls on hard times, loses their job, etc., and you didn't have it all drawn up in a final financial consent order approved by the court, the other party could come back years and years later, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years later even, to pursue your income and your capital.
And I think that so important, because a lot of people will be listening going, oh, well, maybe, well, no, it should be fine. We're amicable. We've agreed it, blah, blah, blah. But the reality is, if one of you suddenly is earning a lot more money, let's say you split up and then you become, got this amazing opportunity. If you haven't got that financial settlement, it's not just that they're fallen into harder times. You might be in much better times. And then they might they go, well, I need a piece of that, because I supported you at this point in your life. So I think it's absolutely critical.
One party could have continued to contribute to their pension, and years later,
someone come after it.
At risk of a share of the fund to the ex-spouse, even though you were divorced, but you hadn't had your financial order approved.
So, what I'm quite keen to understand from your experience is that, when we think about women in money, women in investing, we know that many women are more hesitant to invest, maybe more hesitant to be the person who leads the charge on the financials. As you said earlier on, typically, and we are talking quite generally, but typically it's possibly the man or husband who has taken a lead on the financials and not taken control, as you say, but just it's a very typical relationship that we've seen in the past that happens. What sort of things do you find that women are unsure about when they come to you, that they need that kind of clarification on? So that I'm just thinking that, what we're talking about here is how can we empower ourselves to be in better positions if the worst comes along and you do have to get divorced. So what could some of these women be doing to be in a much better position
Well, I
of
think,
understanding?
you know, things like mortgages, if sometimes I say to a new client, what's the house worth? Often it's don't really know. Has he got a mortgage? Well, yes. And they'll say, oh, yes, it's £900 a month. And I'll say, well, what do you owe the bank? What do you owe the lender? So just, when these financial decisions are made and when they're asked to sign things, perhaps have an understanding about what you're borrowing, how long you're borrowing it over, for example. Debt, there's scenarios where, I mean, if their husband's the greater earner, it's probably going to be him that has the credit card debt, but potentially the wife having lots of debt in her name, which, should all the cards be in, is that right? Joint accounts. I see marriages where the wife doesn't have their own account at all and everything's in the joint account. Perhaps that they should have some control of their own finances. I can tell Gretchen's sort of smirking here slightly.
I am, because also I can hear my people who'll be listening going that, because I do think that we have generally improved that so much, but I, like you, see it because I'm at the end where, this financial settlement's been made and someone comes to me and says, I've now got this, what am I going to do? I absolutely see that they've never had to deal with the bills, or they've never had to deal with understanding how certain things work, and pensions and things. I think, the generation is changing. I do think that there is better education, but I can absolutely guarantee there'll still be people listening who do not have a good handle on what's going on.
Of course, there is financial control.
Yeah, coercion,
And coercion
control.
in a fair few, well, many marriages, and it's kind of noting those sort of red flags, if they're not open about what's in bank accounts and, what's being borrowed. And another classic is money being borrowed from a property to go into husband's business. I mean, if that gets suggested, then you want to be asking a lot of questions and perhaps
Yeah. I
suggesting.
mean, I agree. It sounds common sense, but actually it's more common than you realize. So it's like, what are you signing? And I think also, especially if the finances are seriously skewed. So you're kind of talking about, the men running businesses, husband being a business owner, maybe his wife not having that much in comparison. So the kind of weighting of responsibility is, and the weighting of control is slightly out, isn't it? So yeah, I've had a situation where a client of mine had signed stuff because it was just put in front of her for his business,
If
and she didn't know.
I think if your listeners can at least talk to someone, they don't feel they can go to a professional, but at least talk to a friend, talk it through with someone close to you and say, does this sound right? Do you think I should, get some advice about this? Does this sit right with you? If you're within your support network, and then perhaps hear from a third party whether a step that's being suggested should be taken. I'm not suggesting they get legal advice about their divorce from, any man in the street, but I just mean
No, no.
husband's asking me to do this or wife's asking me to do this. I don't want this to come across it's always wife husband as well. I don't.
Well, that's why I keep saying we're talking in
Yeah.
very generalized terms, aren't we? We know there are differences. Yeah. Yeah. And do you think that slightly off piste from client stuff, but have you in your career and your progression through the ranks, to get to where you are now, have you had experience or even a client where you've seen that there's this disparity, etc., experienced of the gender pay gap, pension gap, and all of that? Because we talk quite often about that, especially about the pension gap.
Do you know what I think the problem with this is? Transparency. Because throughout my career, I don't know whether it's what this happens in lots of countries, but certainly in the UK, in my experience, we don't talk about what we're paid. People don't, even amongst friends, it's kind of rude, isn't it? It's just not appropriate. You don't even say to your best friend, "Oh, what are you earning now?" So I have my suspicions that there is a disparity still in my profession, but I don't have, I don't have any evidence of that because it's not a conversation that, I guess I'm in the
That's
dark.
open.
Like
Yeah.
probably most women. Yeah, that's the reality. I can't quote the percentages, but I think there's still a high percentage of partners. I think in firms I think it's still weighted, to men.
Yeah. And obviously, we know that this pension gap, because the gender pay gap impacts the pension gap, but the pension gap is impacted by a lot of other things as well, by, taking more time off, maybe not contributing to your pension for either children or caring responsibilities, and things like that. And obviously, you're also seeing, you, if anyone, are going to see that firsthand, because the disparity in pension of that pension gap,
Yes,
with your clients when you're comparing what they've got,
yes,
is so significant.
certainly. I can certainly say what happens generally now if a court's considering it, in a divorce scenario, is that more often than not there's a pension sharing order to equalise incomes in retirement. So looking at all funds, an expert, an actuary is instructed on a single joint expert basis to advise what the appropriate pension share should be in order to equalise incomes in retirement. And more often than not, that is the outcome to ensure wife, for example, or the person that's been part-time working to raise the children, more often than not is the female, isn't disadvantaged ultimately. But obviously that's a divorce situation.
Yeah.
But
it's a really interesting one, because for me, the reality is that if you're married, if it ends in divorce, everything's going to at some point be equalised from that situation, pension or other assets. But so often, if you remain together, you end up with this situation. The pension gap is something like almost 50% by the time you get to retirement age. So, but what doesn't make sense to me is that we don't go, right, well, we acknowledge that, and what we should be doing is still contributing to the wife's pension, or the person staying at home's pension, whilst we can, even if we're not working anymore, because ultimately it will be more tax efficient in the long run if we've both got income, from a tax planning perspective. So I think that it's something that we've not spoken about it a lot in the podcast over the series, and it's really important. And it's come up because of, actually, ultimately, if you leave one another anyway, you're going to be looking at trying to equalise everything. So why not try and, get the tax benefits all the way along whilst you're in a happy relationship as well?
I mean, you'll love this question, but I do wish I'd seen a financial advisor earlier than I did, because I have, had advice in recent years, but had I had some advice earlier than I did, I probably would have a healthier pension now, albeit when you're younger, it's the mortgage against the pension, or prioritise, as everyone does. But yes, I'm glad I sought the advice I did when I did, to get on track for retirement, which hopefully I can do when I'm 55. Yes, right. No, I can't.
Well, I mean, it leads me quite nicely onto, I always like to talk to people a little bit about how you balance, having said you've just taken advice and joking about your 55, 50, your 50
Now.
year plus retirement. How do you balance like enjoying life today with planning for tomorrow, planning for the future and that retirement goal?
I'm a planner rather than a spender, I would say. So I'm not to get too, I don't want to get too much into the detail, but I could be drawing more income than I am and spending more money than on nice things. But I don't want to fall off a cliff in whenever it's going to be 15, 20 years time or whenever that's going to be. So I'm not, I'm not someone, I'm sensible. I don't know where it's come from, but I'm generally sensible, as is my husband.
And do you think you've got a good balance of that, or do you think that's...
I think I've got a balance. I mean, we do have, we don't have big flash holidays, but we do have, we do nice. I've got children. We do nice things, and having children is expensive. But I do think I have roughly the right balance. But of course, you never quite know how long you're going to be on this planet, do you? So hopefully I won't live to regret perhaps being more on the sensible side. But
if we all knew what our date was, then the job would be
easy,
right?
Far more fun.
Yeah.
Not as the case may be. Yeah. You're right. There's a balance. There is a balance.
Yeah.
The question is financial advisor when they says, what they say to you about risk, etc.
Well, risk is so many different elements of that, right? There's a risk in being too cautious or too like you've just said, you don't know when your deadline day is, and there's a risk to being too frivolous and not thinking about that too much. So it is about finding balance. Absolutely. So leaning into that a bit, what do you think financial freedom means to you?
Well, not having to worry about money. And as you say, there always are worries. Yeah, true financial freedom would be, being silly now, would be winning the lottery and being able to spend what you like, etc. But would it make you happy? But I think being able to afford a reasonably nice life, not having to worry about where the next mortgage payment's coming from, and not feeling like you can't ever have a holiday. So, yeah, being reasonably secure, but also feeling that you're going to be okay in retirement.
Yeah, it's a big one when you don't know, the question is, how much do you need? That's what you've got to figure out. And that's what your financial advisor's helping you with. So let's just finish off then. What's one piece of money wisdom you'd like every woman listening to take away from today?
Money wisdom. Don't forget about your pension. No matter how old you are, I sound like a financial advisor now, not a divorce lawyer, but
it's all right, you're doing my job for me.
How old you are, even if you're 80, start putting a little bit in, because who knows what's going to happen. There might be no state pension. Who knows by the time an 18-year-old's...
We're at least going to have to be 70 plus, aren't we, by that point?
You're going to be like 99 before you get a bean off the government at this rate.
So it's pension.
Pensions. And just from a professional perspective, if your relationship's going wrong, just get some advice. Don't listen to the man in the street. Don't just get some independent advice. At least one meeting, just to point you in the right direction, so you don't prejudice your position for the rest of your days.
Yeah, absolutely. So on that note, before we end, can you let people know how they can find out more about you, or the best ways to kind of contact you?
Yeah, so I'm a partner in a firm called Geldards, Geldards, in Cardiff in South Wales. So if you Google Geldards, you can find me. And my email address, adrienne.donneky@geldards.com. Always happy to have a chat, just an initial 15-20 minute chat with potential clients, just to see if we can, see how we can help them.
All right. Well, that's been really, really good. Thank you so much for talking to me today, Adrienne.
It's lovely to talk to you, Gretchen.